Hello, and thanks for joining this online lecture where I'll be talking about the debate between free will and determinism. My name is Natalie Wyer, and I'm an associate professor of experimental social psychology at the University of East Anglia. Just to tell you a little bit about myself, I joined UEA in 2017 after working at several other universities in the US, the UK, and the Netherlands. In addition to teaching on the social psychology modules at UEA, I do research investigating the cognitive and perceptual processes that take place during everyday social interactions. One of the things that I've been particularly interested in recently is how we experience agency during interactions. In other words, what things make us feel like our actions have a causal effect on the people and things around us. That feeling, that we are causal agents of change, is closely related to the concept of free will, which is what led me to some of the ideas and questions that I'll talk about today. So today, I want to start out by talking about the connection between consciousness and free will, and how our experience of these things makes it feel indisputable that we are in control of the things that we do. And I'll talk about an alternative perspective, described by determinism, that suggests that our level of control is really quite minimal. I'll then talk about a bit of research that appears to support the idea that we don't actually have free will or control over our actions. So then, if we consider the possibility that free will is just an illusion, how is it that the illusion is created? Why is it that we feel so strongly that we have free will? Why do we feel that we are actively and deliberately deciding what to do, and that those decisions are actually what causes our behavior? I'll explain one theory about how the subjective experience of free will is generated. And finally, I want to say a little bit about what the implications would be if we don't in fact have free will. It's hard to start a discussion about free will without first talking about consciousness. Consciousness basically refers to our current experience, which is made up of qualia, or what you're aware of at this very moment in time. It contains everything that's capable of capturing your attention, whether that's a thought, a feeling, or a sensation. Consciousness can be focused on things happening outside of ourselves, like what it's like to see the color red, to hear a child laugh, or to smell coffee. Or it can be focused on the knowledge retrieved from memory, like feelings about ourselves, thoughts about friends and family, or plans and goals that we've set for ourselves but not yet achieved. So first, what role does consciousness play in our day-to-day lives? Humans aren't unique in having consciousness. Most if not all animal species have something we'd call consciousness, in that they're capable of using whatever sensory system they have to perceive the world and act upon it. But consciousness does play a special role in humans. Consciousness is basically the thread that links the moments of our lives together. Consciousness allows us to reflect on things that have happened in the past and plan for what might happen in the future. So without consciousness, we'd have a hard time relating what we're experiencing right now to everything surrounding this moment in time. When it comes to free will, the ability to choose what we're going to do and then do it, most of us would consider it to be something that happens in consciousness. We're aware of the thoughts that lead to a decision, we experience the act of making the decision, and we're aware of ourselves carrying out our chosen course of action. So in this sense, free will certainly seems to depend on our conscious thought processes. But you might or might not be surprised to learn that the very concept of free will isn't universally accepted. In fact, although more than 80% of people in the general population believe in free will, only 13% of philosophers and about the same proportion of psychologists believe that free will explains human behavior. So let's think about this. Most of us feel like we have free will, but what's the evidence for this? Well, those scholars who argue that free will is the main cause of our behavior make two basic arguments: the argument from intuitions and the argument from moral responsibility. The argument from intuitions is based on the very strong intuition that there are some things that we have control over and that nothing causes us to do them, except for our own willing them. The strongest case for this concerns very simple actions. So for example, suppose that I hold up my index finger and say that I'm going to move it to the right or to the left, but I have not yet decided which way to move it. At the moment before I move my finger, it could go either way. Nothing in my past and nothing in my present seems to be forcing me to move my finger to the right or to the left. I feel like I have total control over what happens next. Whichever way I end up moving my finger, I could always have moved it the other way. So if I move my finger to the right, it seems unquestionably true that I could have just as easily moved it to the left. The argument for moral responsibility is a good example of what philosophers call a transcendental argument. Transcendental arguments attempt to establish the truth of something by showing that it's necessary in order for something else, which we strongly believe to be true, is in fact true. So think about the idea that under most circumstances, people are morally responsible for their actions. For example, if Bob steals money from his company in order to help pay for a new sports car, we would justifiably hold Bob accountable for this action, and we'd think that it was appropriate to punish Bob for this crime. But a necessary condition of holding Bob responsible is that Bob's action was one that he chose, one that he was in control of, and one that he could have chosen not to do. So holding him responsible only makes sense if we assume that his actions were chosen, that he could have chosen not to steal the money. So holding people responsible for their actions requires that we believe that they had free will over committing those actions. At this point, you might be thinking, well, sure, it's obvious that we have free will, so what's the problem? Well, there is an alternative view. According to determinism, all of our actions are perfectly predictable by knowing the physical factors that are relevant to causing the action. So, for example, if I knew everything about your genetic makeup, your past experiences, and the current environment that you're in, I could predict with absolute certainty what you were going to do next. Determinism denies that there is free will because it assumes that human actions are subject to the same laws of physics as everything else in the known universe. And one of the fundamental laws of Newtonian physics is that every action has a cause. We may not always be able to observe the cause, but we know that there is a cause. So if that's the case, can we say that free will is the cause of our actions? Well, not really, because that begs the question, what causes free will? So for example, I decided to make a cheese omelet for breakfast this morning. Why did I do this? Advocates of free will would say that I could have chosen to do something else. I could have had a mushroom omelet, I could have had a bowl of cereal, or I could have skipped breakfast altogether. So according to the free will perspective, nothing forced me to choose to make the cheese omelet. But a determinist would say, how can that be? The choice had to come from somewhere. It didn't just pop into existence from nothing. We might not know all of the complex set of conditions that led to my choice, but that doesn't mean that they weren't the cause. And to this, the free will argument might go, well, we're not saying that something comes from nothing. We're just saying that we ourselves, as agents, cause our decisions, and nothing else causes us to cause those decisions. But the problem, of course, is that then we just go around in circles. We, as agents, are responsible for causing our decisions, but nothing causes us to make that decision. Then we're back to having something that comes from nothing. And if we concede that something did cause us to make the decision, then we have to start tracing back to what caused that thing to cause us to make that decision, and so on, and on, and on. So that's just the philosophical debate. What does science have to say about it? Well, let's go back to our example about how we know we have free will. When I hold my finger up, I can choose whether to move one way or the other. Whatever I end up doing, I could have done the opposite. This, according to proponents of free will, is evidence that our choices cause our behavior. However, foundational research by Benjamin Libet seems to support the view that free will by itself does not explain our behavior. Instead, our conscious decisions to perform actions, that is, our experience of exercising free will to execute an action, actually happen after the action has already been initiated by our brains. In those studies, participants made voluntary hand movements whilst their brain activity was being recorded. They reported the point on a clock at which they had made the decision to move, and those times were compared with brain signals that set the movement in motion. The results showed that conscious decisions did precede the actual movement by about 200 milliseconds, but brain activity started even earlier, about 500 milliseconds before movement. In other words, the brain apparently began preparing for a movement 300 milliseconds before subjects had the conscious impulse to move. So what this shows us is that conscious decisions are preceded by unconscious processes in the brain by about a third of a second. So decisions are not made consciously. Decisions are made unconsciously and only later become conscious. Given this, it becomes hard to argue that free will, the conscious choice to act, was actually the causal agent in producing action. On the contrary, it may be more likely that conscious thought was produced to explain the action that had already been set in motion by the brain. In other words, perhaps our conscious experience of free will is merely a story that our brains produce in order to make sense of our behavior. So we have this argument that our conscious experience of free will is actually just an illusion, a trick played on us by our own brains. If that's true, then there might actually be lots of situations where we are mistaken about whether actions are produced by our conscious decisions. Dan Wegner, an experimental social psychologist, has been one of the leading theorists on this topic, and he suggested that there are at least 3 categories of situations where we might be mistaken about the role of free will. In the first, he suggests that there are actually a variety of ways that people show illusions of control, believing that they've chosen to produce an action when in fact they haven't. The second category is sort of the reverse. It includes situations where someone has actually engaged in an action, but they reject the idea that they caused the action to occur. And finally, there's confabulation, where someone basically comes up with a mistaken explanation about how they produced an action. Dan Wegner has produced quite a bit of research illustrating each of these categories, and we'll take a look at one example in a few minutes. So let's pause here and recap. We've talked about the debate between free will and determinism, and we've seen that, at least in some situations, conscious decisions to act actually occur after the action has already been initiated. And we mentioned 3 different illusions, or ways that we can be wrong about how much free will is responsible for our behavior. I'll come back to describe some research that illustrates one of these illusions, but first, let's think about how these illusions could come about in the first place. In other words, how can we reconcile the subjective feeling of having free will with the evidence that our actions aren't actually caused by our conscious decisions to act? One possibility is that free will is real, and that we do in fact control our actions through consciously exerting our will. But it's just that we can also be tricked into feeling like we've exerted free will in situations where we haven't. In other words, it's only through cleverly designed experiments that we can be tricked into falling for these illusions of free will. The second possibility is that our experience of free will is always an illusion, and that our conscious thoughts are never actually the causes of our actions. This is the view endorsed by Dan Wegner, and led to his development of the theory of apparent mental causation. So the second possibility is a bit harder to wrap our heads around. If free will is always an illusion, how does the illusion get generated? Well, Wegner argues that it's basically a problem that we often see in interpreting correlations. If 2 things happen together, we often think that there's a causal relationship between them. And we often think that the one that happened first caused the one that happened second. But it's also possible that some third variable is causing them both. In the case of conscious thought and associated actions, they tend to happen together and in a particular order. We have the thought first, and we do the action second. For example, if I'm sitting around the house and I have the thought, I want some chocolate, and then shortly afterwards I eat some chocolate, it's natural to believe that the thought, I want chocolate, caused the action, eating the chocolate. But in fact, this is a common logical fallacy. Just because one event reliably comes before another doesn't mean that they're causally connected. It's also possible that they have a common cause, and that one is just faster to occur than the other. So what is that common cause that produces both conscious thought and action? Well, according to Wegner's theory, it's an unconscious cognitive process, some sort of neural activity that both produces conscious thought and initiates an action. So conscious thoughts and actions have a common cause, unconscious mental processes. So what happens according to this theory is that some unconscious process sets in motion both a thought and an action. The pathway to conscious thought is faster. We become aware of it first. The pathway to action is a bit slower, so we become aware of it just after the thought has entered consciousness. Because the two things, thought and action, happen together and seem related, we infer causation between the two, which generates the experience of having willed the action with our thoughts. But in fact, our conscious thought is just a byproduct of the same unconscious process that produced the action. So we've just seen a theoretical explanation for how it is that we have such a compelling experience of having free will, of controlling our actions through our conscious thoughts. But why don't we feel like we're having a causal effect on everything? We have conscious thoughts all the time, and we observe things happening just after those thoughts all the time. But we don't always feel like we caused them. So there's still a question about how we know for sure whether we were in control of a given action or outcome, or whether it was actually caused by someone or something else. In other words, the question is how we come up with explanations about the causes of events. At a very basic level, we'll tend to attribute actions to ourselves when the physical, social, and personal cues are compatible with our having caused it. So for example, imagine that you walk into a room and the lights go on. What caused that to happen? Was it you, or was it something else? Well, if you know that you just flicked a switch, or maybe that the light is activated by a motion sensor, then this should contribute to the feeling that you caused the light to go on. Moreover, if you're the only one in the room, and if you intended to have the light on in the room, this will also make you more likely to feel like something you did was the cause. But what if a friend walked into the room at the same time through another door, and maybe they flicked a switch at exactly the same time that you did? Which of you caused the light to go on? Here it's not so simple to understand whether you caused the event or not. So this suggests that the cues that we use to claim control or authorship of an action can sometimes lead us astray. This was an idea that was tested by Wegner, Sparrow, and Weinerman in a really interesting experiment. So they brought in 2 participants at a time, and they assigned one of them to be an observer, and the other one to be what they called a hand helper. The hand helper would have to stand behind the observer with one arm extended on either side of the observer so that the observer could see the hand helper's hands. Moreover, the observer's own hands were hidden by a cape. And you can see an example of what this looked like in the black and white image here. So anyway, what happened in the experiment is that the hand helper was given instructions over headphones for what to do with their hands. So they were told to wave, give a thumbs up, things like that. In one condition of the experiment, the observer wasn't given any headphones, so they just see the hand helper's hands moving randomly. This was called the no preview group. In a second condition, however, the observer was given headphones and heard the same instructions as the hand helper was given. So for them, they hear the instructions, and then they see a pair of hands in roughly the same place as their own hands would be, carrying out the actions described in the instructions. This was called the preview group. So in other words, they're provided with a number of cues that might lead them to attribute authorship over the actions to themselves. And that's exactly what they did. When observers were asked how much they felt that they were doing the actions that were actually being done by the hand helpers, they gave significantly higher ratings in the preview group than in the no preview group. What's even more interesting is that on another question, where they were asked how much they felt that they were looking at their own hands performing the actions, a similar pattern of results was seen. So here we see that people perceive themselves to be in control of things that happen with different cues when different cues are compatible with that attribution. But those cues can be misleading. So that's just one example, but there are many others. Collectively, the scientific evidence can't rule out the existence of free will, but it does seem to clearly establish that free will isn't necessary to explain our actions, and that it might just be something that we turn to in order to help us explain the things that we do. At this point, I want to finish by returning to one of the other arguments that free will advocates use to support the existence of free will. That is, we believe that it's right to hold people morally responsible for their actions, but it only makes sense to do that if their actions were freely chosen. If something outside of our control forced us to act in a particular way, we shouldn't be held accountable for it. That conclusion would make sense if we believe that the existence or absence of free will is an all or nothing proposition. And some scholars do believe in one extreme or the other. However, when surveyed, the majority of philosophers endorse a middle ground, called compatibilism, which argues that freedom is actually a continuum. Our actions can be more or less freely chosen, and where they sit on that continuum should have a large bearing on whether we're held morally responsible for them. According to this view, the freest actions are the ones where we think carefully about all of the relevant information and then act according to reasons that we've judged to be most valid or in our best interests. Our actions are less free when we don't have all of the relevant information, or we don't think about it thoroughly, and so our decisions are based on faulty reasoning. So in our example earlier about Bob who stole money from his company, if we know that Bob knew what he was doing and was motivated only by his own greed, then we would consider his actions to be more free, and we'd be right to hold him responsible. In an alternative scenario, where Bob transferred money out of the company account because his boss told him to, and he was neither aware of the consequences nor personally benefiting from his actions, we'd consider him to be acting less freely, and we shouldn't judge him as harshly. So that's about all I want to talk about during this video, but I want to leave you with something to think about, which we can come back to discuss when we meet together in June. So here's a thought exercise. Consider a child that's raised by white supremacist parents, and they grow up having white supremacist beliefs, and they're taught to act on those views. So as a child, to what extent does this person have free will? And as an adult, do you think that changes? Do they have more or less free will than they did as a child? Consider your answer with reference to one of the three views that I've talked about during this video: free will, determinism, and compatibilism. So that's all for now. I hope you've enjoyed the short lecture, and thanks for your attention, and I will see you soon.